Lutheran at South 13th and Mitchell Streets. Mr. Fischer comes from Grover, Wisconsin. Now, I looked up G.W. Schmeling and I couldn't find anything about it. This is a misprint because his first initial was actually H. And it turns out that actually his daughter was the second wife of Pastor Fischer. So he was a professor at Watertown, so it would make sense that he would have been there at the installation at that time. Just a couple pictures, what I have over here. I found it interesting that almost all the pictures we have in our archives shows Pastor Fischer with children. And I think that's important because throughout his ministry, he always was very strong in Christian education. And the fact that he has a lot of pictures of him with children makes sense. So this is 1943, the Cradle Roll Christmas Party. Here is a Children's Eve service in 1947, and the caption said it was the grades 4 and 5. Anybody in that class that you remember? Oh, okay. Then this is a collage which is out on the table in the corner there, and also I have it here too. And this actually was kind of something that was put together and sent out as a Christmas card in 1944. Okay. Then a couple other notes, and make sure I'm not missing anything here. This is a celebration of his 25 years in the Holy Ministry. And this, of course, is when he was attending when he was pastor at St. Jacobi, and a nice brochure. There is a folder over there that has that actual anniversary. Then also, this is his 35 years in the Holy Ministry when he was an Emmanuel in Mankato. Now, I thought this was interesting because one of those sheets that you picked up is a greeting from Pastor Kretzmann on his 35th anniversary. I'm not going to read through it, but I thought it may be interesting for you to read through. And it talks about the struggles that Pastor Fischer had gone through in his ministry. And when I talk about that a little bit later, I think it will make sense. So you can take that home and just read it through for yourself if you want to. Then I'd like to go through and talk a little bit about some important events in his ministry. He was the first pastor at Eastside Lutheran Church in Madison, and he strongly encouraged the congregation to start a school, which is still in existence today. Any of you ever been to?
I was assigned to Eastside, the MLC.
Yes.
But you showed a picture of the old church. I don't think that was around anymore.
Probably, right.
I taught at the newer church,
Mm-hmm.
which was on the east side of Madison.
Right.
And we had a pretty good-sized school then, so that would be 1968. This is a little bit earlier.
Yes, yes, right, yeah. Then moving on to St. John's in Grover, he again showed a strong concern for young people. He did something as far as requirements for confirmation, as well as emphasized Sunday school, Bible class, and starting a Christian day school. Although it's interesting because he talks about the Sunday school as being necessary when you have students who don't go to the day school or you don't have one available. So you can see that he was very concerned about having a broad Christian education for all the young people. He also made the comment that if you do have a Christian day school, you should not expect the students of that Christian day school to go to a Sunday school. And that's been a debate around for years, and I, as a former teacher, also felt too that it's nice to keep the two groups separate because very often the day school gets much more intensive in their studying, so that kind of leaves the Sunday schools behind. Now, there's two sides to the issue. I'm not going to make a big deal about that. One instance that was talked about, that in 1936 they had a new parsonage built for the Fischers, and supposedly they had some bees in the attic, and Pastor Fischer was supposedly had been guilty of starting a fire up there to drive them away with the smoke. And as a result, it burned down the parsonage. Now, his grandson said the family lore says that this was not really his starting the fire, it was some faulty wiring. So, but it's an interesting story. Interesting story. This is where it gets a little bit more interesting and serious also. He received a call to Emmanuel Lutheran in Mankato, Minnesota. And at the time, there were some concerns about some of the Wisconsin Synod congregations in that area getting a little bit liberal as far as their dealings with different things. And so several people encouraged him to take that call because they felt he was a very solid theologian as well as pastor, and he did so. When he accepted the call and got to the church, he found some of the members were concerned about, the idea of scouting, that the Wisconsin Synod had taken a pretty strong stand on that, and that's one of the issues that, of course, has separated us from the Missouri Synod. The other thing is also there is the question about military chaplaincy. If you remember during the Second World War especially, the Missouri Synod were very active in having military chaplains that would serve our forces, especially overseas. My own father actually worked with a Missouri Synod chaplain, and he played organ, a little portable organ for the services and things like that. So what has happened in the years, though, the Wisconsin Synod has said, we have real concerns about the fact that you have somebody who's been sanctioned by the government in the Army or the Navy, whatever service, and that they would preach to whoever would be there, and they would also have to be responsible for people of other faiths. And so this is really a matter of fellowship that created great concern. So what happened then is that some of these members that were, we consider a little bit more liberal in the sense that they wanted scouting and also chaplaincy and some of the other issues that went along with that, they wanted to start a Missouri Synod congregation. So what happened as a result, there was quite a conflict that arose in that area. And the conflict not only included the Wells versus the Missouri Synod, but also the ELS. And that's what this article talks a lot about because of that, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod, which is based in Bethany, which is what we call the Little Norwegian Synod, they worked very hard to try to work with the Missouri Synod officials. And there was an agreement that they would not have a congregation of the Missouri Synod that would allow scouting. However, once that congregation started, they called a pastor from Minneapolis who allowed them to have scouting, and it created a lot of concerns. And this pastor really got kind of pretty far out because he even wrote letters to the students at Bethany Lutheran College and said, well, I'm the local Missouri Synod pastor, so you should really come to our church. And this created a lot of conflict back and forth, and as a result then, the Missouri Synod was not considered very gracious in that area of the whole thing. This really kind of foreshadowed what was going to happen in the 50s in terms of the actual split that took place in 1961, where both the Wisconsin Synod and also the ELS then decided to break away from the Missouri Synod. Now, what happened then as a result of this is that Pastor Fischer became very concerned about the growing liberalism in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And as a result, he convinced his congregation to actually leave the Wells in 1956. Some of you probably kind of remember the whole issue about this, that there were a number of conservative pastors within the Wells who said we did not break away from Missouri Synod soon enough. And as a result, they started their own synod, which is now called the Church of the Lutheran Confession, or the CLC. Have you heard of the CLC? Okay. In fact, there is a church just down the road from us in Hales Corners. I'm sorry, what's the name of the church, Beth? Messiah. And their pastor is actually the president of the CLC. He's also related to my wife. And the reason for that is because some of you probably know Professor Joel Gerlach. His brother, Vernon Gerlach, was a teacher at Emmanuel Lutheran in Mankato. And I found a bulletin from there at a graduation service is that Pastor Gerlach was going to be leaving Mankato and going to Arizona because he had extreme arthritis. And so that's where Pastor Gerlach, Vernon Gerlach ended up. And he spent the rest of his ministry teaching at Arizona State University down in Phoenix. And he passed away, how many years has it been? Yeah, so fairly recently he's passed away. And Joel Gerlach, of course, is his younger brother, and he's over by the zoo in a retirement village there too. Yes?
What did he teach at Arizona State?
Do you remember? I thought it was math. I don't remember. That's a good question.
I was just thinking, that's a very conservative person to be in a public college or university.
Right. And I think it was something like that. I'm pretty sure it was math, which would have been a problem. So the whole thing that happened then as Pastor Gerlach, Joel Gerlach, and Vernon and his brothers, they actually were briefly in the CLC for a time. And interesting enough then, a sister who married a Gerbitz, and they lived in the Milwaukee area, they stayed in the CLC, and they passed away a few years ago, but she was a member of Messiah in Hales Corners too. So there's a lot of kind of connections back and forth between that. Okay, now, what happened then as a result is all these different debates within the synods and so forth did take a toll on Pastor Fischer. So that his health became rather poor, and he even suffered a heart attack. He went to Winter Haven, Florida for a while to recover, and even started a CLC mission down there. And that, of course, that gets us to the talking about the CLC, the Church of the Lutheran Confession. They are headquartered now in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Does anybody know the name of their college? Emmanuel Lutheran. That name is significant because Pastor Fischer and his congregation, when they were now new members of the CLC, said, we need to start a school to train our pastors and teachers. So the CLC college actually started at Emmanuel in Mankato, and then in, I think I have the, later on it moved down to Eau Claire, where now is their school, both a high school and a seminary and a college too. So Pastor Fischer passed away on June 10th, 58 of a severe heart attack. His funeral was at Emmanuel Lutheran in Mankato on June 12th, 1958. Pastor Norman Madsen from the Bethany Lutheran Seminary spoke at the funeral. And I just mentioned that because that showed there was still a strong relation between Pastor Fischer and the members of the ALS as well as the CLC. There was an announcement of his passing away in the St. Jacobi Bulletin on June 29th, 1958. And at the June voters meeting, it was decided to send $50 to the Fischer family as an expression of their sympathy. And I'm not sure how many of you remember that, but that was part of the ongoing legacy there too. Now, one other area I wanted to talk a little bit about then was his involvement with the Synodical Conference Hymnal Committee. Now, he was secretary of the Liturgy Committee, and when I served on the 93 Hymnal Committee, we had two big committees. One involved itself with liturgy, and the other committee was involved with picking out the hymns for the new hymnal. So he was involved with the liturgy. Now, this was something that was done by the Evangelical Lutheran Synodical Conference of North America. That's kind of an impressive title. We often refer to this as the Synodical Conference, okay? That was organized in 1872 at St. John's Lutheran Church in Milwaukee. We recently celebrated that anniversary. Now, it was not at the St. John's Bleat church where it was done, because there was an old church that was nearby. But that's actually the location. And did I say who it involved with? Okay, so I have them in my notes. The congregation, or the synods that were involved with the Synodical Conference would have been Illinois, Minnesota, Missouri, the Norwegian Synod, and Ohio. And this became a very strong voice for conservative theology and practice in America. And it pretty well lasted up until the breakup that happened between the Missouri Synod and the Wells and the ELS. Okay? But they were responsible for the 41 hymnal. In fact, if you look in the front of the book, it says there, as authorized by the Synodical Conference. And I worked at the publishing house, and one of the things we dealt with was copyrights. And Concordia Publishing House claimed that they had all the copyrights to the 41 hymnal of anything that was new. Well, I went to a course once with Professor Hillert down at Concordia in Chicago, and he said, it says in the book that it was authorized by the Synodical Conference. So anybody that was a member of the Synodical Conference has rights to that, including the Wisconsin Synod. So I wouldn't take that to court, but I thought it was an interesting sidelight there too. Okay. And this hymnal then became really the very most common hymnal that was used throughout the United States in Lutheran churches. And one of the things that Pastor Fischer talked about too is what a blessing it is to go to another church that you're in fellowship in and to be able to open up the hymnal, to know the liturgy and things like that. Because up to that time, basically every synod had their own hymnal. We had our own one. And so this is something that really brought congregations together a lot. And I remember growing up, because I actually grew up in the Missouri Synod, going to other churches, including Wisconsin Synod as well as Missouri Synod. Page 515, we all knew what that was all about. We could all sing it and that type of thing too. Okay. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about Pastor Fischer's influence on the worship life in the Wells. He was never in a position of authority like being on a synod a committee where he was in charge of things. He wasn't on the commission on worship. He also wasn't a professor. However, I believe he had a lot of influence simply because as you look up his different things that he had written, he wrote a couple major articles in the quarterly of the seminary that talked about liturgy and its importance. And he had several important things that he talked about. One thing was the idea of the Lutheran chorale. And what that is important for is to remember that many fine hymns were written at Luther's time, like Mighty Fortress, and then shortly after that. And we talk about those as being the Lutheran chorale. And that has a special term that covers all these big hymns. From heaven above to earth I come. Wake, awake, for night is flying. And one of his concerns is that what has happened in American Lutheranism back in the early 1900s is that we had gotten away from those chorales when we went from German to English. So what we needed good translations of them. And he mentions a couple hymns like the Old Rugged Cross and In the Garden as being something that many English Lutherans were wanting to sing because that's what they knew from their background. So his point is that we should revive these Lutheran chorales, have good translations in English so that our people could sing them. And one of his really important points is that we have to teach them to the children. And I'm really happy to hear that he said that so long ago, because I was involved at the publishing house, and actually my wife was helping out too, is we created a new curriculum for hymnology that includes many of these classic hymns, and the idea is to teach them to the children. The one we sang on Sunday, God's Own, the baptism hymn, that's in the curriculum, correct? So there's many fine hymns, some of them newer, but some of them the older ones too, like A Mighty Fortress, that are included in there. And throughout his ministry, so often he talked about teaching the children about the good old hymns. Also, he talked about liturgy. Now, when you hear that, what do you think about? The order of service. And really, in terms of the worship folks, it has a broader concept. Because liturgy, especially as most of our seminary professors talk about today, and this is throughout the synods, really involves the whole idea of a structured worship service. Now, the highest point of that, of course, is the order of service. But beyond that, or behind that, is the idea of a Christian church year. Now, most of us have grown up with the idea of having Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Easter, but there are many elements to that where there's been historical series of readings that we use throughout the church year. Now, it used to be a one-year series, but then about 50 years ago in the 70s, then they came up with a 3-year series. Which is interesting is because it wasn't actually the Lutherans that did this, it was the Catholics. And that's one critical thing that even Pastor Fischer talks about. The Catholic Church has a lot of good stuff when it comes to worshiping God. And one of the things is they emphasize the use of the liturgy and the use of the church year. Now, if you look in the 41 hymnal at the beginning, there's pages and pages of different things that talk about the different Sundays for each church year and also the reasons, the different readings you're supposed to use. I remember as a child sitting in church before church and kind of bored, so I'd open up and kind of read through that. The other thing that's in those listings is also the introits and collects that were used Sunday by Sunday. Now, the introit, if some of you remember, used to be between the first lesson and the second lesson. However, we kind of fell away from that, so today instead of using an introit, what do we use? The Psalms, okay. And really, that's kind of a development that happened, especially in the Wisconsin Synod, is they got away from the traditional introits. I remember going up and in junior choir, we would sing from a book that was published by Concordia that had these introits, which were like verses of the Bible that were set to music that were meant to emphasize the theme of the service. So the whole idea of this traditional liturgy and church year was something very near and dear to his heart for Pastor Fischer, which was not so much true in a lot of the other Wisconsin Synod pastors. And I think this, I can't prove it, but I'm thinking this probably reflects his exposure to, for example, Concordia, St. Paul, and other Missouri Synod pastors, and also working on the hymnal committee. He learned to appreciate the benefit. And not just from an academic standpoint, or not something that says, oh, we have to do what they did 200 years ago. Instead, it was something near and dear to his heart that would preach the gospel, and the idea often talked about having the church year as presenting the whole history of Jesus and what he has done for that. He also talked about the use of the historic liturgies. And this is something that if you look in that other sheet I gave you, it has 3 hymnals listed, the 41 hymnal, the 93 hymnal, and the 2021 hymnal. And what's the title at the top? That term, the common service, is very important in the history of liturgy, because what happened in the 1800s, a bunch of the Lutherans, not Wells, not even Missouri Synod, got together and studied what did they do at Luther's time. And what they did is they came up with an order of service which really goes back to the Roman Catholic Mass. Except what happened at Luther's time, there were some bad things that had crept into that. In fact, Pastor Fischer has a couple articles where he talks about the whole history of how the early Christian church set up this wonderful way of worshiping Jesus that includes readings and hymns and things like that. But then the Roman Catholic Church and, of course, the Eastern Orthodox Church started adding different things that were not good. One of the main things that Luther had to scrub out of the Roman Catholic Mass was the idea of the unbloody sacrifice, so that what happens in communion is that the Catholic Church actually teaches we're once again sacrificing Jesus. Why do we say that can't be right? It is finished. It is finished. So we don't have to do that again. So what they have made the Mass into is not something that Jesus is coming to us and bringing his body and blood. Instead, they turn around and it's something that we do for God as a, quote, a good work. And that is something Pastor Fischer was very clear on and continually taught about how the fact that in the sacrament, the Lord comes to us. And then what happens, of course, as a response, we sing our praises to him. So, what happened then in 1888, the Lutheran churches, especially out east, put together this common service, which wasn't always so well received with a lot of churches. In fact, the early Wisconsin Synod didn't have much use for it because it was the old Lutheran stuff. However, what happened is in the 41 hymnal, there was enough strong theologians that were involved with it that they said, this is a good pattern for worship that we would like to use in the 41 hymnal. It became important part of it. It became page 5 and 15. And as it shows there, we basically have kept the same order of service for the next two hymnals. And one part of the service that Luther especially had concerns with was the Eucharistic prayer. Now, Eucharist is a word that we don't use too often, but it refers to Holy Communion or the Lord's Supper. And what happened is in the Catholic Church, the Eucharistic prayer became a prayer to Mary and the saints, and it turned things all around and had a lot of false theology. So what happened is that Luther said, let's get rid of this. But later Lutheran churches and later Lutheran theologians decided, let's bring that back in a positive form. And we have that today. In our new hymnal, in the new order of service, we actually have what would be considered a Eucharistic prayer. Does it come before or after the words of institution, Pastor? Just before, right? Right. And that is really a revival of something that had been around for centuries, but now we're bringing it in a positive way, because the idea that Eucharistic prayer is to focus on what does this really mean? What does the order of service really mean for us too? And that's why I gave that outline. That would be something fun to do sometime, is maybe have a whole session on just talking about our new liturgies and how they reflect both the ancient services as well as also the contemporary services. Okay. Another thing Pastor Fischer was very big on was in having good Lutheran children's Christmas services. And he really emphasized the idea of having something that the children could use to really tell about Jesus and what Jesus has done for that. And also part of that is singing good German Lutheran hymns in the service, of course, in the English translation too. So he actually put one together, and it's over on the table there, an outline for a Christmas service. And Concordia also published one of his also too, so that he would really encourage that. And again, I think this is a wonderful reflection on his ministry, that he wasn't just somebody up here doing all the right things in a scholarly way. Instead, he was a practical pastor that would really emphasize teaching our young people so that they appreciate the whole glory of Jesus and what he has done for us. Yes?
When I was growing up at Garden Homes,
Yes.
it was the identical service every Christmas Eve, all the children's services. We learned it that way, right? Well, and that's right. But by the time we were in 8th grade, we were all saying the entire thing. Because we knew exactly what was coming. The little kindergartners went first, and then first graders, and it was always exactly the same. But it was kind of funny to know that whole thing by heart by the time we got to 8th grade.
And that was part of his emphasis too, is to teaching something that the children would really grow up with so that they would remember for their whole lives too. Yes?
I remember growing up
That's true. Actually, the publishing house does produce a Christmas service every year. And they used to have, and I had a file of all the old Christmas booklets, but then they went to an electronic version where you buy a kit and then you download the things and print it out that way too. And then the hymns would be printed in the bulletin too. I'm going to just take a little break here. Any other recollections of Pastor Fischer that any of you would like to share with me? Yes.
When Pastor Fischer went to Mankato, as I understand it, there must have been some rumors that he was kind of run out of St. Jacobi or kicked out of St. Jacobi. And Mr. Kopatsky was the chairman of the St. Jacobi congregation and wrote a letter to the congregation there saying that no, it wasn't true, that he was run out of St. Jacobi. So kind of, and I think maybe even the congregation at the time was kind of an affirmation of their pastor.
That makes sense because everything I have read that he was well received here and did a lot of really good work here. John?
There are records in the minutes of discussion over the doctrinal things going on, especially in the Minnesota district. And Pastor Fischer knew full well what he was getting into, as it were, when he accepted that call. There was some discussion with our council about that, and the council was supportive of him going because they knew that there was something bigger that was going on.
And as it turned out, that very much was the case. And it was a very positive thing, especially as we dealt with the ELS and trying to stave off some of these things became very important, which finally broke up the synodical conference too. Okay, yes?
During that time that he served here, were there other pastors working with him? Like now we have more than one pastor. Was he the only pastor in his churches?
John, do you remember the overlap with some of those things?
Yes, there were some assistant pastors that I don't remember the name that they're in the history book, but most of them did teaching in school as well and had helped in the ministry.
Yes, very possible. Yes, right, right. Okay. So, what I'm trying to give you a picture of is a pastor who was not only a very learned person, who knew his Bible, who knew his theology, and was very strongly saying this is what the Bible says and stick by it, but also he was a very pastoral pastor in the sense that he was concerned about his congregation. He repeatedly talks about we have to teach the young people. We have to teach the adults about what the liturgy means and the things like that. Because it wasn't the idea, well, we do this just because we've always done it. He wanted to show to people that we do this liturgy, we do these hymns and so forth, because they, in a wonderful way, tell us about what Jesus has done for us, too. I'd like to close then with a prayer, and I'll read it if you can't read it up there. This is a prayer that Pastor Fischer wrote in 1945, and it was attached to his personal will. And people think that really this is reflecting his prayer for himself and also his congregation, St. Jacobi. So I'd like to read that. May the Lord pardon me for all my trespasses, and may he take my family into his fatherly care. Keep them faithful in his word unto the end. May he preserve my dear congregation loyal and faithful to his name, that from generation to generation the word of God be taught in truth and purity, and we as children of God lead a holy life according to it. Amen. I think it's a wonderful prayer, and I think right now in our celebration of the 150 years of St. Jacobi, we can see that he is one of the wonderful pastors who helped us to achieve that wonderful purity of doctrine, but is also a very strong educational program with our children, as well as also providing, for example, something like this, a wonderful chance for us to talk about these things too. Thank you for your time. Any questions? I do have a display over there which you're welcome to look at. That's one thing I've noticed. Most of the pictures show him with a generous amount of hair, and that he did very well. Very good. Okay. So again, I thank you for your time, and I hope this has been some benefit to you as we celebrate our 105th anniversary. A couple quick commercials. We still have some of the ornaments that are available, and also this Saturday is the wine and cheese and hors d'oeuvres event with Andy Brown doing some singing, and Beth is going to be around here if any of you need to buy tickets yet too. Yes?
Just an announcement.